I remember as if it were yesterday the first time I heard this story. A Soviet fighter plane in the midst of World War II falling into American hands. For many, this might seem like just another curious episode between allies, but in fact, it was one of the most revealing moments in aviation history at the time. Just imagine an aircraft built in Moscow factories, designed to face the dreaded German Messerschmitts, being disassembled, studied, and finally piloted by United States officers. Back then, the world was divided by battlefronts and ideologies, but there was something that united all pilots: a passion for flying and respect for a good machine. I always say that the air has no flags, and when a pilot takes to the skies, what matters is what the plane can do. That's precisely what the Americans discovered when they got their hands on a captured Soviet fighter jet. What began as simple curiosity turned into genuine admiration. They expected to find a rustic, heavy, difficult-to-control aircraft, and instead they discovered a true dancer of the skies. Today, I want to take you with me on this journey. Let's go back in time, understand how this plane ended up in American hands, who the pilots were who tested it, and what they found when the engine roared for the first time under the control of a foreigner. This story isn't just about metal and speed. It's about respect, surprise, and the incredible power of human engineering in times of war. To understand what happened when the Americans tested that Soviet fighter jet, we need to go back in time a little. It was the beginning of the 1940s, and the world was plunged into chaos. Nazi Germany had advanced ruthlessly across Eastern Europe, and the Soviet Union was desperately fighting to contain the advance of Hitler's troops. The skies over the Eastern Front were a veritable hell, a place where a pilot's life could last only a few minutes. Meanwhile, the United States was not yet fully involved in the conflict, but was already closely observing everything that was happening. They knew that sooner or later they would have to enter the game, and they wanted to understand what the Soviets were doing to resist. In that scenario, every new aircraft, every engine, every aerial weapon developed could mean the difference between victory and defeat. The Soviet Union, isolated with few industrial resources and under constant attack, needed to create fighter jets that were quick to produce, resistant to cold, and above all effective in combat. This is how the legendary Yakovlev and Lavochkin fighters were born. These aircraft lacked the technological refinement of Western models, but compensated with simplicity and performance at low altitudes. They were machines forged in urgency, created to fight with what was available, on frozen dirt runways and under constant enemy fire. While the Soviets produced robust and agile aircraft, the Americans invested in technology, range, and operational comfort. The P-51 Mustang, the P-47 Thunderbolt, and the P-38 Lightning were the pride of the United States. Powerful, fast fighters with great range and advanced equipment. But there was a question that no one in the US could yet answer. How did Soviet aviation compare to all of this? Had the Russians really developed something that could rival the best of American engineering? It was in this atmosphere of curiosity, espionage, and veiled respect that this story began to unfold. A story that would unexpectedly unite pilots from two powers who, although fighting on the same side, knew that the post-war era would be a completely different kind of conflict, no longer one of bullets and bombs, but of technology and supremacy in the skies. No one could have imagined that a simple navigational error and a forced landing would change the course of aviation history. It was 1944, and the war was already beginning to show signs of exhaustion. The Soviet advance was pushing German forces further and further west, and the skies of Europe were filled with aircraft of all types: Allied bombers, German interceptors, and of course the fast Soviet fighters. Amid this confusion, a Soviet fighter jet, according to some records, a Yakovlev Yak-3, although other sources point to a Lavochkin Lay-7, he became separated from his squadron after intense combat over Poland. The pilot, facing fuel problems and engine damage, decided to risk landing in territory controlled by Western troops. He had no idea that he would end up making history. American forces quickly surrounded the area. As they approached the aircraft, they realized it wasn't a German fighter. It was an unknown model, with elegant lines, a lightweight structure, and a high-pitched, powerful engine. The red star painted on the fuselage dispelled any doubt. That plane came from the heart of the Soviet Union, after verifying that the Soviet pilot was alive and, in a way, relieved to have fallen among allies. The fighter jet was carefully transported to an American airbase. The United States Air Force Command saw this as a rare opportunity to study, up close, the technology of an ally who was, at the same time, a future competitor. The technicians carefully disassembled each part of the aircraft. They noted the use of simple, lightweight materials and a design focused on performance and ease of maintenance. No luxury, no complex systems. Everything there had a clear purpose: to function quickly, directly, and effectively in extreme conditions. When the aircraft was reassembled and declared operational, the next decision came naturally. Someone needed to fly it, and this is where the story begins to come to life. American pilots, accustomed to the most sophisticated machines of the time, volunteered for the test. They wanted to experience for themselves what was so special about this Soviet creation. They didn't know it, but they were about to discover an aircraft that would redefine their notions of maneuverability and control response. An airplane that, despite its simplicity, had a soul and flew with the ferocity of one fighting for the survival of an entire nation. When the Soviet fighter arrived at the American base, nobody knew exactly what to expect. I remember reading accounts from officers of the time describing the atmosphere as a mixture of fascination and distrust. That machine was, at the same time, an Allied relic and a technological enigma. The USAAF Command authorized its careful restoration, calibration, and testing under controlled conditions. After all, nobody wanted to risk losing a pilot or destroying the rare aircraft on its maiden flight. The engineers began their work. They inspected the radial engine, the plywood structure, and the control surfaces. They were impressed by the simplicity of the design. Everything was functional. There were no extra instruments, no comforts. The cabin was cramped, the seat rustic, and the panel seemed almost improvised. But at the same time, the whole thing had something mesmerizing. It was light, straightforward, without excesses. One engineer even commented, "They built a combat aircraft with the soul of a racing fighter." Meanwhile, the test pilots took turns circling the plane like predators assessing new prey. Men accustomed to flying Mustangs and Thunderbolts observed the Soviet fighter with a mixture of skepticism and respect. "It looks like a toy," one of them said. "It's too small to withstand a dogfight." But there were also those who noticed the most important detail: that Soviet toy seemed built to fly fast and turn even faster. There were no manuals. No American knew how to operate its starting systems, nor how to properly adjust the engine mixture. It was necessary to improvise, translating labels written in Cyrillic, adapting instruments for imperial measurements, and above all, understanding the temperament of the machine. When everything was finally ready, they chose an experienced pilot for the maiden flight, someone with enough composure to handle the unexpected. He climbed into the cockpit, looked around, and took a deep breath. He was about to take off in a plane that until that moment had been just a legend, a piece of Soviet warship now resting under the California sun. Outside, the technicians waited in silence. The engine roared with a different, higher-pitched, almost metallic sound. The fighter jet vibrated, came to life. That was the first breath of a machine that had crossed half the world, and now, under a new pilot, was about to show what it was truly capable of. When the day of the first flight arrived, the air at the base felt heavier. We all knew we were facing a unique moment. The small Soviet fighter, now painted with discreet test emblems, rested on the runway like a wild animal about to awaken. I approached slowly, touching the cold aluminum and wood fuselage. The texture was different, almost rough, but it conveyed solidity. This was not a parade machine. It was an instrument of survival. I climbed into the cabin and immediately felt the cramped space. There was almost no clearance between the seat and the panels. The instruments were marked in Russian. Some of them I had to memorize before starting the engine. The forward visibility was good, but the rear visibility practically non-existent. Still, something told me that this plane wanted to fly. I turned the key, moved the levers, and the engine started right up. The sound was unlike any other American fighter jet. High-pitched, rhythmic, with a short roar that seemed eager for freedom. The fuselage vibrated, and the plane rocked on the ground as if it wanted to take off. I asked for permission, and without further hesitation, accelerated. The small fighter shot down the runway with almost absurd lightness. Before I knew it, the wheels were already in the air. It was at that moment that the surprise hit me. The plane responded to the controls with unbelievable precision. I only had to touch the stick and it obeyed. In the first turns, it seemed to be reading my thoughts. It climbed powerfully, spun like a falcon, and in the tight maneuvers. In the tight maneuvers, it simply left anything I had flown behind. As I gained altitude, I looked at the airspeed indicator and saw numbers that didn't match the feeling of exertion. The plane was fast, but what impressed me most was its agility. It seemed to float between the controls, without resistance, without inertia. I would do a light dive, and the engine would respond instantly, propelling the fighter as if it had a life of its own. For a few minutes, I forgot I was piloting a captured enemy aircraft. It was just me and the sky, and that Soviet plane teaching me that genius can be born even in the harshest conditions. When I finally touched down again, my heart still racing, I looked at the officers waiting outside and simply said, "Gentlemen, this little devil flies better than he looks." After the first flight, the entire base seemed filled with a different kind of energy. The pilots gathered in the hangars, curious, restless, discussing what they had heard. "They say it turns like a devil," someone murmured. "But can it handle high speeds?" Another replied with a skeptical smile. It was impossible to hide the curiosity. Everyone wanted to experience the Soviet fighter jet. In the following days, the tests intensified. Each pilot who took the controls returned with a different gleam in their eye. It wasn't the kind of enthusiasm that usually accompanied a routine mission. It was pure admiration. The aircraft seemed to play with the wind. In simulated combat, it left even the agile P-51 Mustang behind in the tightest turns. The lightness of the fuselage, combined with simple and efficient aerodynamics, made it an unexpectedly dangerous adversary. I remember one of the test pilots, Captain Harris, getting out of the cockpit and taking off his helmet. Sweaty but smiling, he said, "This plane is like a lightweight boxer. It doesn't have the strongest punch. But if you blink, it's already behind you." The engineers observed everything attentively, recording data, comparing graphs. The low-altitude performance was extraordinary. The fighter climbed quickly, reacted well to abrupt maneuvers, and maintained control, even in the most aggressive turns. The structure, however, revealed the price of this agility. It was too light. It would not withstand long combats or severe damage. But as far as pure piloting was concerned, the Soviets had created something exceptional. There were also moments of discomfort. The engine, although powerful, required delicate adjustments. The cabin, without pressurization and almost without insulation, vibrated intensely. American pilots were accustomed to relative comfort, wider cockpits, hydraulic controls, clear panels. The Soviet fighter, on the other hand, was crude, direct, almost primitive. And yet it worked. After a few weeks of testing, one thing became clear. The Soviets knew what they were doing. They had prioritized what mattered most on the battlefield, maneuverability and simplicity. The rest, for them, was superfluous. The final report from the American pilots began with a sentence that would become legendary. "Underestimating the enemy is the first step towards being overcome by him." At that moment, everyone understood that Soviet aviation was in no way inferior to the Western powers. They simply followed a different and very effective philosophy. The comparative tests were the moment when everything got more serious. It was no longer just about curiosity. It was a technical, almost scientific study. We wanted to know, with numbers and sensations, how the small Soviet fighter jet performed against the giants of American aviation, the P-51 Mustang and the P-47 Thunderbolt II icons, symbols of the United States air power. We started with the Mustang. Its Packard Merlin engine roared with powerful smoothness, and its straight-line speed was unsurpassed. It could fly high, far and fast, hunting enemy bombers over Germany and returning with fuel to spare. The Soviet fighter, on the other hand, was the opposite. Short range, limited endurance and minimalist design. But when we put the two in joint maneuvers, the story changed completely. At low altitudes, the Yak or LA-7, the versions tested varied depending on the batch, seemed to have an advantage. On tight turns, it turned before the Mustang even reached half the radius. Its lightweight structure and balanced center of gravity made it a master of agility. I myself in the seat felt I could dance in the air with almost intuitive precision. The Mustang was noble, elegant, but it needed space. The Soviet car didn't. It attacked, retreated, and disappeared, all in seconds. Next came the Thunderbolt. The P-47 was a beast of a different nature, large, heavy, almost indestructible. Its 2,000 horsepower radial engine and its robustness made it a tank with wings. In prolonged combat, the American would have the advantage. It only needed to withstand the first few moments. But in the first seconds of an aerial duel, the Soviet fighter could get into an attack position before the P-47 even finished a turn. It was David against Goliath, but a David with sharp wings. The pilots began to realize something that transcends numbers. The Soviet design philosophy did not seek mechanical perfection. It sought practical efficiency. The Yak and the LA-7 were aircraft built to survive the battlefield, not to cross oceans. They were machines created to fight in the trenches, provide immediate cover and win in seconds. In the end, when we put the reports side by side, the conclusion was clear. The Soviet fighter jet may not have been the most beautiful, the fastest or the most durable, but in terms of agility and responsiveness, it was simply unbeatable. These results raised eyebrows among many American engineers. After all, how could an airplane built in simple factories under constant bombardment compete with the jewels of American industry? This was a question that would still generate lengthy discussions and an unexpected dose of respect. After days of flights and comparisons, I needed to understand what made that Soviet fighter jet so agile. It didn't seem to defy the laws of physics, but somehow it seemed to dance within them. So together with the engineers at the base, we began to disassemble the aircraft piece by piece. What we found inside was a lesson in simplicity and genius combined. First, the structure. The Yak-3, the one we tested most frequently, used a fuselage made of a combination of aluminum and plywood. Wood. In the midst of the metal age and precision engineering, the Soviets were still using treated wood to reduce weight and costs. However, the result was a light, fast aircraft that was easy to repair even in makeshift workshops, often just a few kilometers from the front line. A Soviet mechanic could replace entire panels with basic tools and industrial glue. Then the engine. The Klimov VK-105PF, a 12-cylinder V-engine, was compact, powerful, and surprisingly reliable. It didn't have the smoothness of the Mustang's Merlin engine, but it responded quickly, almost instantly to acceleration. It seemed to pulse with the same nervous rhythm as the pilots who flew it. And that explained a lot. The plane was made to respond, not to last. It was a fast attack machine, a predator that depended on speed and surprise, but the biggest secret lay in the overall balance. The Soviet fighter had an ideally positioned center of gravity, which made it extremely maneuverable. The control surfaces were large relative to the size of the fuselage, meaning that a slight touch on the stick was enough to completely change the plane's course. For pilots accustomed to heavier aircraft, this sensitivity was almost frightening. I remember an American engineer saying, somewhat disbelievingly, "They didn't build an airplane. They built an extension of the pilot," and he was right. It was as if the Soviets had understood that, in aerial warfare, speed wasn't enough. It was necessary to create a machine that reacted even before the pilot could think. This philosophy, which sounded almost intuitive, stemmed from the brutal necessity of the Eastern Front, surviving quick and deadly duels, often fought at less than 1,000 meters altitude. At the end of the disassembly, we all looked at the plane differently. That wasn't improvisation. It was strategic engineering. The use of simple materials wasn't a sign of backwardness. It was a sign of intelligence. The Soviets had learned to extract maximum performance with minimum resources. I realized that day that the true strength of that fighter jet lay not only in its engine or wings, but in the philosophy that created it. It was a reflection of a people who struggled with what they had, and yet still found a way to fly higher. After analyzing every detail of the Soviet fighter jet, it became clear to me that we were dealing with a completely different approach than ours. In the United States, the focus was on power, range, and durability. Our planes were imposing, sophisticated, often even luxurious by wartime standards. The P-51 Mustang, for example, could fly thousands of kilometers, carried extra fuel tanks, had advanced instruments, and a powerful engine for high altitudes. The Soviet fighter, on the other hand, had no global ambitions. It didn't need to cross continents or survive prolonged bombing runs. It had a clear mission: to defeat the enemy in the air in close combat in a matter of seconds. And this influenced everything: the size of the aircraft, its weight, the choice of materials, even the engine design. Every decision reflected the brutal reality of the Eastern Front. Where aircraft were produced rapidly, soldiers were trained under pressure, and survival depended on agility and speed of reaction. I realized that, for an American pilot, flying a Soviet fighter jet was an almost surreal experience. Our instincts told us that a heavy aircraft was safer, more reliable. But with each maneuver, each abrupt turn, the Soviet fighter showed that lightness and simplicity could be an equally powerful weapon. It offered no comfort or prolonged endurance, but it gave the pilot a feeling of absolute control, of anticipating the enemy's movement. This difference in philosophy also generated a kind of silent respect. Some of us, engineers, pilots, even commanding officers, began to see the Soviet fighter not as a curiosity or a threat, but as a lesson in efficiency. There was a functional beauty there, a lethal minimalism that worked perfectly in its context. It wasn't just engineering. It was strategy applied to metal and propeller. The reflection deepened even further when we compared the tests of the small Yak-3 with the robust P-47 Thunderbolt. In the direct duel, each aircraft revealed its priorities: endurance versus agility, power versus lightness, range versus instant maneuverability. Each engineering style reflected a culture, a way of facing war. And honestly, it was impossible not to admire the courage to design such a daring aircraft, knowing that it would need to survive with limited resources and in extreme conditions. In the end, I understood something fundamental. There is no absolute best in aviation. There is the right aircraft for each purpose. And that Soviet fighter, simple and fast, was living proof that sometimes less is more, especially when it comes to flying over enemy territory and surviving the most critical seconds of combat. After the initial flights, the tests became increasingly daring. It was no longer just about observing how the Soviet fighter behaved on simple trajectories. Now we wanted to explore its limits, how far it could go without compromising pilot safety. And honestly, I never imagined I would be so surprised by what I saw. We began with simulated combat maneuvers. The small plane responded as if it were alive. A simple touch of the control stick, and it executed tight turns, rolls, and dives with almost supernatural precision. I felt as if I were piloting an extension of my own body, something I had never experienced in any P-51 or P-47. The feeling was one of total freedom, but also of pure responsibility. The slightest mistake could mean loss of control, as the lightweight fuselage did not forgive carelessness. Speed, in turn, was another surprise. The Soviet fighter didn't have the most powerful engine among American fighters, but its power-to-weight ratio allowed for rapid and impressive acceleration. In short dives, it reached speeds that defied our expectations, and in turns, even at high speed, it maintained stability. It was a combination that few American aircraft could match without significant effort. We also tested extreme evasive maneuvers, simulating enemy attacks. The fighter responded almost instinctively, allowing for rapid changes of direction without significant loss of altitude. On many occasions, the instructor commented, "If this aircraft had been in the hands of Soviet pilots on the Eastern Front, it would have given any Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf a headache." But it wasn't just numbers and curves that impressed. It was the feeling of pure agility, the almost telepathic connection between pilot and machine. Each flight left the American pilots more fascinated and even a little humbled. It was impossible to ignore that in a few minutes, a simple plane could overcome the complexity and size of our best fighter jets in specific situations. The engineers also recorded everything: angles of attack, control response times, acceleration during dives, structural resistance in critical maneuvers. Each piece of data was analyzed and compared to the parameters of American fighter jets. And the more we analyzed, the clearer it became. The Soviet fighter jet was not just an airplane, it was a lesson in efficiency, courage, and adaptation. As the sun set over the base's runway, we all looked at the small Yak or Lay-7 parked there, and it was impossible not to feel a deep respect. It had overcome our initial prejudices, demonstrated its agility, and reminded us that war is not just about power or technology, it's about strategy, instinct, and adapting to what you have available. After weeks of flights, tests, and analyses, the time had come to formalize everything. The Soviet fighter jet was no longer just an object of curiosity or a dangerous toy. It had become a study tool for the USAAF. The pilots who had flown the machine wrote detailed reports, describing every nuance of the aircraft's behavior, every surprise encountered during maneuvers, every impression that the simplicity and agility of Soviet engineering provoked. What was most striking in the official documents was the consensus on maneuverability. In low-altitude combat maneuvers, the Soviet fighter consistently outperformed the best American fighters, including the P-51 Mustang. Its lightweight fuselage, combined with a perfect center of gravity and large control surfaces, made it almost impossible to follow in fast, tight turns. Many pilots reported feeling a kind of connection with the aircraft, describing the control response as immediate, almost intuitive. However, the reports also pointed to clear limitations. Range was short, structural strength was limited, and the aircraft would not withstand prolonged combat or serious damage. For long-range missions or strategic attack, American fighters remained superior. But for quick and decisive combat, the Yak-3 or LA-7 was a formidable force, capable of exceeding the expectations of those unfamiliar with its design philosophy. High-ranking officials observed that the tests not only revealed the aircraft's performance, but also provided a strategic lesson. The Soviet Union didn't need to compete directly in terms of technology or engine size. They needed to create efficient machines for specific conditions. Every detail of the design reflected this practical and brutal approach. Born from the need for immediate survival on the Eastern Front, I remember reading a passage from the final report that perfectly summarized the admiration and respect of the American pilots. To underestimate this aircraft would be a mistake. Its simplicity and agility demonstrate a combat philosophy that challenges our conventional engineering concepts. It is not just a fighter jet, but a testament to the effectiveness of adapting to the context of war. At that moment, it became clear to all of us that the experience was not just about testing a foreign machine. It was also about learning to respect different approaches, distinct design philosophies, and intelligence applied to warfare in unexpected ways. After weeks of flights and tests, the American pilots began to reflect on something bigger than just numbers and performance charts. It wasn't just a matter of speed, range, or structural resilience. It was about combat philosophy, strategy, and adaptation. Each flight with the Soviet fighter taught us something new, and I could feel that everyone involved was changing their perception of what it meant to be an efficient pilot. The first lesson was clear: agility is worth its weight in gold. In an aerial duel, seconds can determine survival or defeat. While our American fighters prioritized power and range, the Yak or Lay-7 showed that the ability to turn quickly, react instantly to enemy movements, and exploit every inch of the sky was equally vital. It was a pragmatic approach, forged in real combat, with limited resources and under extreme pressure. The second lesson concerned simplicity and functionality. I was surprised by how easily the Soviet fighter could be repaired or adjusted. There were no complex systems nor superfluous parts. Each component had a purpose, and this reduced the margin of error in critical conditions. For us, accustomed to sophisticated and technologically advanced aircraft, this simplicity was revolutionary. Another key lesson was about respect for the enemy and for the engineering of others. American pilots realized that it didn't matter whether an aircraft was produced by allies or not. What mattered was its effectiveness in combat. A seemingly modest aircraft could outperform the best American models in certain situations, and ignoring this would be a strategic mistake. I remember discussing with colleagues how this experience changed the way we evaluated aircraft and combat tactics. And finally, we learned something more profound. Each design philosophy arises from specific needs. The Soviet fighter was not just an airplane. It was a reflection of a people struggling with limited resources in a cruel terrain against a fierce enemy. Every detail, from the lightweight fuselage to the compact engine, told a story of adaptation and survival. For us, it was a lesson in humility, recognizing that talent and efficiency can manifest themselves in unexpected ways. In the end, flying that fighter jet wasn't just a technical experience. It was a human experience, teaching us to value ingenuity, creativity, and courage, characteristics that, regardless of nationality or flag, make any pilot and any machine extraordinary. During the tests, there was no shortage of curious stories that showed how much that Soviet fighter jet messed with the pilots' heads. I remember one morning when Captain Harris, always serious and meticulous, returned from the runway with a smile rarely seen on men accustomed to military discipline. He recounted, laughing, that during a tight turn, he felt he could literally follow the plane in his mind even before touching the controls. Another pilot, Lieutenant Collins, reported something even more impressive. He described a high-speed dive maneuver where the small fighter responded almost automatically, maintaining stability and allowing him to easily regain altitude. Collins commented that, in his words, it seemed as if the plane had eyes of its own, anticipating every movement. It was a way of praising the harmony between engineering and pilot skill. It wasn't just reports of perfect flights. There were also tense moments. When pilot forgot to adjust the fuel mixture correctly and the engine began to fail mid-air. The lightweight fuselage meant that every vibration was felt as a warning. However, even in these critical situations, the aircraft responded with impressive reliability, allowing emergency maneuvers that could have been fatal in other models. These stories were told in corridors and hangars, amidst laughter, debates, and gestures of admiration. Each pilot had their own experience, but they all shared the same conclusion. The Soviet fighter jet was not just a machine, but a school for learning to fly. It challenged preconceptions, taught respect for simplicity, and showed that the most sophisticated is not always the most effective. Even when I reflected on these accounts, I realized they went beyond piloting. Each story carried a lesson about adaptation, courage, and perception. Pilots accustomed to flying heavy, technological machines had to learn to trust their instincts, connect with the aircraft, and respect the intelligence behind every part, every turn, every acceleration. With each flight, with each account, the impression solidified. That captured Soviet fighter was not just an airplane. It was a living lesson in strategy, engineering, and humanity in wartime. And I, as an observer and narrator, knew that these accounts would be remembered for a long time, not just as a curiosity, but as an example of what it means to adapt and overcome limits under extreme pressure. After weeks of testing and flights, it became clear that the Soviet fighter jet was not just a curiosity, it had something to teach the Americans. I remember meetings in the hangars with engineers, pilots, and high-ranking officers discussing every detail of the aircraft. It wasn't just the agility that impressed, but the philosophy behind each design choice. And slowly, these ideas began to influence future projects. One of the first lessons applied was the importance of maneuverability in close combat. Before that, many American projects prioritize power, range, and armor, without paying much attention to the aircraft's immediate response to commands. But after observing the Yak-3 or Lay-7's ability in tight turns and rapid changes of direction, engineers began to consider adjustments to flight plans, controls, and even the weight distribution of the new aircraft. Another important influence was the search for simplicity and efficiency. The Soviet fighter demonstrated that it was possible to create a lethal aircraft without excessive complications. Simple materials, quick maintenance, and immediate responses were strategic advantages that could not be ignored. I remember discussing this with an engineer who said, "If they can achieve such high performance with so little, why can't we learn something from them?" Furthermore, the experience reinforced the idea that each aircraft must be designed with its context in mind. The Americans realized that not all combat requires complex technology or long-range autonomy. Sometimes, what matters is the ability to move, react, and survive in critical moments. This philosophy began to permeate future studies of fighter jets and air combat strategies, showing that learning can come from unexpected places, even from an ally whose technology seemed less advanced at first glance. Ultimately, this experience generated respect. American pilots and engineers learned to value ingenuity and applied intelligence, regardless of nationality. I realized that the captured little Soviet fighter not only flew with impressive agility, it also carried with it a lesson in humility, recognizing effectiveness where it is least expected and absorbing knowledge from any possible source. Ultimately, those tests left a legacy that transcended World War II. They showed that engineering isn't just about power, but about adaptation, strategy, and creativity. And for me, as the narrator of this story, it was fascinating to witness how a seemingly simple aircraft could impact the mindset of an entire air force. Reflecting on this entire experience, I realized that the impact of the Soviet fighter goes far beyond tests and technical reports. It left a legacy that even decades later is still studied and admired by pilots, engineers, and historians. I always say that an airplane is not just metal and propeller, it is the embodiment of an era, a need, a philosophy. And this small fighter captured by the Americans was exactly that, a symbol of Soviet ingenuity amidst the most brutal war of the 20th century. Its most immediate legacy was practical. American pilots returned to their hangars with a new perspective on what it meant to maneuver, react, and fight in the air. The ideas of lightness, simplicity, and agility began to influence subsequent tests, designs, and training. Some principles we learned from that Soviet fighter were subtly incorporated into later designs, showing that war is, above all, a school of constant learning. But the impact wasn't just technical. The Soviet fighter also left a human lesson: respect for the enemy and for creativity in adverse conditions. I remember watching American pilots, men accustomed to leading, planning, and judging, humbly admitting that they had never seen anything like it. They realized that the most advanced or the most expensive isn't always the most efficient. Sometimes, genius arises from necessity and simplicity. Furthermore, the story of that captured aircraft became an inspiration. For engineers and pilots who came after, it was a reminder that innovation and adaptation go hand in hand. And even today, when I study military aviation from World War II, I think about the agility of that Soviet fighter and how it changed, even subtly, the mindset of the American Air Force. For me, the true legacy of the aircraft lies not only in the tests or official reports. It lies in the lesson that courage, ingenuity, and adaptability can overcome limitations of resources and time. It reminds us that on any battlefield, or even in life, valuing what is functional, efficient, and well-planned can be as powerful as having the most sophisticated or expensive machine. Looking back and reflecting on this whole experience, I realize that piloting or even observing a Soviet fighter jet captured by the Americans was more than just a historical curiosity. It was a lesson in adaptation, ingenuity, and respect. The small plane, with its lightweight fuselage, powerful engine, and impressive maneuverability, showed us that simplicity can be as powerful as advanced technology, that strategy often triumphs over size or brute force. For me, as a storyteller and aviation history enthusiast, this experience symbolizes something greater: the human capacity to create intelligent solutions, even under extreme pressure. The American pilots who flew that Soviet fighter returned not only with technical data, but with a new understanding of what it means to fly with precision, confidence, and courage. Every turn, every dive, every maneuver showed that even the smallest aircraft can teach giant lessons. If you enjoyed this story and want to continue exploring fascinating stories about technology, courage, and curiosities, be sure to subscribe to the channel WW2 Pilots, turn on notifications, and leave a like. And listen up, in the next video, we're going to change the scenery a bit and talk about another incredible universe, farms and ranches, discovering secrets and stories you never imagined about life in the countryside, and working with animals and farm machinery. So stay tuned, because just like in aviation, rural life also has its heroes, challenges, and valuable lessons. See you in the next video, and remember, every story has something to teach us. We just need to look closely.